Vampire Iniquity. Book 1 of the Tugurlan Chronicles. By Eileen Sheehan. Copyright 2016 Eileen Sheehan. Portions of this story may prove too graphic, sexually explicit, or violent for sensitive readers. This novel is intended for adult readers.
Author's note: The Tugurlan Chronicles has been in the making for many years. Unlike my other novels, it is not a paranormal romance with a hunky vampire to fall in love with alongside the woman who is telling the story. Instead, it is a complex tale that is told by Dan Tugur, a Tugurlan descendant whose family shortened their name to Tugur when they moved to the USA. It contains the stories of many within the whole. Book 1, Vampire Iniquity, starts you off with the awakening and realization of the powers the Tugur cousins possess when it comes to slaying vampires. It blends fact with fiction, horror with happiness, discovering love with losing love. Although Book 2, The Cure, takes you away from the horrors and cruelties of the vampires of Book 1, the Tugur cousins are faced with a new dilemma and new vampires to deal with after Bruce Tugur battles a family of werewolves. Even so, there is still room for romance to bloom as the story progresses. Vampires of a different nature are introduced in Book 3, Vampires and Werewolves. Along with these new vampires, the vampires from Book 1 surface once again, bringing new problems and renewing old ones for the Tugur cousins to find solutions for. In the meantime, the seeds for yet another new romance are planted. I feel this story is an entertaining page-turner, yet because of the mixing of fact with fiction and the horror it contains in Book 1, I feel I must warn my readers who have grown accustomed to the typical steamy vampire romances I create and quote Dan Tugur by saying this about Book 1, Vampire Iniquity.
I would like to point out that this story is not for the weak of stomach or faint of heart.
Book 2, The Cure, and Book 3, Vampires and Werewolves are a little closer to what I would normally write, although from the point of view of a male instead of a female. So, now that you are informed and ready to enjoy reading the story I took great pleasure in writing, you can curl up in your favorite chair and read the Tugurlan cousins' unbelievable tale of romance, heartache, adventure, and peril. Happy reading!
Prologue. Long before Bram Stoker wove his tale of Dracula for the world to read as fiction, there existed a true creature of the night who went by just such a name. Did Mr. Stoker know this? I question if he might have, since much of what he wrote reads with remarkable accuracy. If Mr. Stoker's intention was to write a biography of an unbelievable being under the guise of fiction, he did a decent job but missed a great portion of significance. To withhold such information from the unsuspecting masses to believe or not believe as their conscience allows, is a wrong I don't want attributed to me. The story I'm about to share with you is a recount of true experiences of which I was a major player. It's a tale of loving and finding love. It tells of family legacy and solidarity. It speaks of friendship, loyalty, bravery, compassion, and I'm sorry to say, horror. Because of this, I would like to point out that this story is not for the weak of stomach or faint of heart. You'd expect to find a story like this in the fiction aisle of your brick-and-mortar bookstore instead of the non-fiction section where it truly belongs, and that's okay with me. In fact, I prefer it. It makes it easier to tell a story that I find unbelievable even though I lived through it when it's formatted and touted as fictitious. I feel free sharing the details under the guise of make-believe. There were times that I was not in the company of all who were involved, yet their experiences played a role in the story and should still be shared. In these cases, I will do my best to keep the story flowing by telling how it happened to the best of my knowledge while weaving myself into the story at the appropriate times when I personally experienced or witnessed it. My name is Dan Tugur. I'm a vampire slayer and this is my story. So, I begin. Chapter 1. You could hear a pin drop in the dojo as I listened intently while Sheehan addressed the class. The students sat in neatly defined rows while giving him their utmost attention. I smiled as I recalled the first time we met, 10 years earlier. It was early evening. I was 17 and feeling my need for independence. I just had an argument with my parents about this very fact. I was in my final days of high school and my parents wanted me to focus on college, while I wanted time to discover who I was and what I truly wanted in life. I felt restless. It was time to strike out on my own, at least for the summer, and discover new people, places, and things while my parents thought I should be focusing on selecting a college and a career goal. The fact of the matter was that I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I'd worked part-time over the years at the local gym to pay for my lessons in martial arts after my father became disabled and the household budget no longer allowed for those types of extras. I thrived on the physical discipline. The gym offered me a position as a personal trainer. All I had to do was study and take the test, but without my parents' support I hesitated. Instead, I followed that old saying, when in doubt, do nothing. I was deep in thought and brooding over yet another heated conversation with them over that same topic while I attempted to walk off some of my frustration when I walked straight into Sheehan coming out of his uncle's dojo. I apologized, excused myself, and continued on. He stood watching me for a moment before he crossed the street and walked in the same direction. When I turned the corner, a searing pain pierced my temple as a set of brass knuckles slammed into my head. I fought to keep my senses while a small group of thugs circled me. Sheehan stopped and watched intently. Blood visibly trickled down my face as I positioned my body for combat. It was obvious to him that I was trained in kung fu and, although my style was unusual, I showed skill and promise as I fought off an occasional attack from the circling thugs. A young couple walking past slowed down enough to see what was happening and then moved on with apathetic disinterest. Sheehan hesitated. He was still new in the country and wanted to keep a low profile, but he was unaccustomed, and even surprised, by the type of apathy he'd just witnessed from the passers-by. Shaking his head in disbelief, he moved in a rapid cat-like motion across the street. In a flash he was positioned next to me. "What are you after, China man?" someone in the group shouted. The others joined in with more taunts and laughter as the circle tightened. Their leader held up his fists in preparation for battle. He was excited to have the opportunity to display his fighting ability. "Maybe he wants some of this? Is that it, China man? Do you want some of this?" he taunted. Sheehan showed no emotion as the leader moved forward and threw a punch. He blocked it with his arm and kicked his attacker in the face with incredible accuracy and force, sending him crashing to the pavement with lightning speed. The other thugs shouted their threats as their circle tightened. Sheehan paused briefly to acknowledge me and coiled for action. Before I knew what was happening, he took down the rest of the thugs. I shook my head in amazement as I stared at the heap of bodies. "Are you okay?" he asked. Although his accent was strong, his command of the English language was very good. I grabbed his outstretched hand and shook it. "Thanks, man," I said with genuine gratitude. "I think you need the hospital," he said. "I think I need to learn to fight like you," I replied. I'd been a student of martial arts for years, but I'd never been taught moves like I'd just witnessed. In fact, I'd never seen anyone move like that and I wanted to learn. "I saw you coming out of the dojo a few blocks back. Are you an instructor there? Tell me yes and I'll enroll right now." Sheehan grinned and nodded. He'd recently immigrated from China and was assisting at his uncle's dojo. He walked with me to assure himself I didn't have a concussion. While walking, he answered my questions. True to my word, I became a student the very next day. It wasn't long before I earned status as the star student and was paired with Sheehan for demonstrations to new groups. He was an easy 5 inches shorter than me. His wiry physique looked to be no match against my lean, muscular, Nordic-type body. Upon our first pairing, when I stood before Sheehan I was certain I'd learned enough to show him I was his equal. That was an arrogant misconception that I'd live to regret. What he lacked in size, he more than made up with skill and wit. I was quickly humbled. As time progressed, we were paired together more and more by his uncle. We eventually learned each other's style, strengths, and weaknesses. Our mutual respect for each other's abilities grew steadily as our relationship went beyond that of student and teacher, and we formed a strong and solid friendship. As the years progressed, I was asked to assist in teaching and was assigned a few classes to teach on my own. Since I'd also gone ahead and gotten my personal trainer credentials and accepted the position at the gym I'd been working at, my schedule was pretty complete. The students sat in a relaxed group on the floor, listening intently to Sheehan's soft, confident voice as he lectured. You do not have to rely on physical build, but on a logical sequence of movements. No matter how hard you train or work to improve, there will always be someone bigger than you, stronger than you, or faster than you in one way or another. Speed is important. You can overcome your opponent's superiority by applying these principles of speed. If you cannot overcome your opponent with one principle of speed, you can beat him with another method of speed. There is the speed of traveling, the speed of distance, the speed of readiness, and the speed of reaction. He paused and surveyed the students' faces before continuing. Now, the speed of traveling is when speed can be calculated in feet per second through a punch or a kick. The speed of distance is the theory that the straight line between 2 points is the shortest distance. Therefore, punching straight is shorter and quicker than a hook punch or a swing. He searched the room with his eyes until he found me. Smiling devilishly, he motioned for me to come to the front of the room. I obeyed and got into position without being asked. To bring your foot with a roundhouse kick to the head covers a greater distance than a shorter and quicker punch to the head, he said before demonstrating. I responded quickly to block his powerful kick. It is typical to cock back your leg or arm before executing a movement, he continued. This wastes valuable time in the extra motion. It also clues your opponent on your next move. He demonstrated again. Once again, I blocked what could have been a painful impact. When your power is not generated just by the moving hand or leg, there is no need to cock. You use the other side of your body to pull back as you rotate to push out the punch or kick simultaneously. This is what we call the speed of readiness. People spend most of their time practicing until they are good with all these techniques. In true combat, the application is not priority. This is because the proper reflexes and feeling of balance must be developed. You can train and fight with yourself all day long, but unless you apply the techniques with another person, you will not get very far. A fight requires at least 2 people. Sheehan bowed to me. I reciprocated the gesture before returning to the back of the room. He motioned for the group to rise and then paired them off. The pairs bowed to each other and began practicing what he just demonstrated. He walked slowly around the room, stopping on occasion to provide some one-on-one instruction. The group had an odd count for attendance, leaving an enormous man standing on the side of the room in need of a partner. I groaned as Sheehan motioned for me to partner up with that student. As I moved in position, I felt a surge of aggressive energy projecting from this gigantic man who looked to have the blood of Goliath running through his veins. I swallowed and looked over at Sheehan with uncertainty. My friend and instructor maintained a stone look on his face as he methodically walked around the room and pretended not to notice my distressed glowering. Resigning myself to the situation, I bowed to my opponent. Sheehan clapped his hands and Goliath went into action. Sheehan had a pleased glint in his eye as he watched my lean, muscular body move with agile style and grace against the aggressive assaults of my king-sized opponent. Chapter 2. I entered the neighborhood diner and eased myself onto the stool at the counter. The waitress, Lucy, smiled and nodded in my direction and I gave a slight wave. She poured a cup of coffee and silently slipped it in front of me while she examined my face more closely. "That looks like it might hurt, honey," she said as she cupped my chin in her hand and studied the bruises on my jaw and temple. "I'm all right," I assured her. "Some ice might help." "Good idea," she replied. Sheehan arrived in time to witness the exchange between Lucy and me. Since the day he'd marveled over how women were drawn to me. "I can't tell you why they are, exactly. I guess the fact that I am considered handsome was a major factor, but he declared it to be more than that. He said it's as if I held some magic spell over the female species. I need only enter a room and they were at my mercy. Unfortunately, I too had little resistance to this so-called magic. It made it practically impossible to stay monogamous. I'd confided my woes about this on more than one occasion to him. He felt this wouldn't be the case once I met my true mate and not just a female I was highly attracted to, as I was with Jessica. He liked Jessica well enough, but he could clearly see the relationship was held together by her efforts more than mine. As Lucy disappeared into the kitchen, he gently slapped me on my back before easing himself onto the stool next to me. "You look like hell, my friend," he said. "Are you hungry?" I asked with a scowl. "I ordered steak, raw." Lucy returned with ice wrapped in a towel and gently helped me position it over my temple. She smiled sheepishly at Sheehan before scurrying off to fetch him a cup of coffee. He chuckled and slowly shook his head as he watched Lucy blush when she dropped a cup. "You were up to it," he said. "You just need more confidence. I believe in you, man. You need to believe in you too." I rolled my eyes as I listened to him give me the standard speech he used on new students. I was anything but insecure with my knowledge and abilities. Knowing this, Sheehan occasionally antagonized me with such comments as a quirky form of amusement. I stopped trying to impress upon him years ago that I didn't find this type of nudging humorous. I winced when he lightly cupped my chin to inspect the damage. "That son of a bitch seriously wanted to kill you," he mused. My chuckle had a sarcastic ring as I replied, "You noticed? It was a damn good thing he didn't know what he was doing. He's one crazy bastard. That is why no one wants to pair up with him," he said with a grin. "You knew this?" I growled in surprise. "You have come a long way over the last few years," he said appraisingly as he smiled and accepted his coffee from Lucy. I may have been annoyed with the teasing, but it was good to see my buddy in such a feisty mood. It was a long time since I saw Sheehan smile, let alone show his devilish, teasing side to such a degree. After his parents died in a boating accident and his uncle loss of one of his eyes and full use of his leg while trying to save them, he took on most of the responsibilities for the operation of the dojo. The pressures were intense and, as a result, he was quiet and serious most of the time. "You're pretty chipper tonight." "It's nice," I said. "I have something to show you," he said eagerly. He reached into the inside breast pocket of his windbreaker and pulled out an envelope containing the most recent letter and picture sent to him by his fiancée. He carefully set the picture on the counter and slid it in front of me. "Hey, man, she's beautiful," I said in earnest. I couldn't have been more serious. My friendship with Sheehan exposed me to the Chinese culture and its people, and I'd developed a strong understanding and appreciation for them and their ways. Not only would this young woman be considered a beauty in her culture, but there also wasn't a man alive who could look upon her and not appreciate her femininity. He was a lucky man. He beamed with excitement as he said, "I want you to be my best man." I knit my brows together and looked my friend straight in the eye. He'd lived in my country for a little over a decade now. He'd maintained his family's business and, in the process, created a solid financial foundation for himself. He was a handsome catch that any woman would be happy to have. I questioned his decision to marry a woman an ocean away when there were plenty to be had in his own backyard. "Are you sure this is what you want?" I asked. "Don't get me wrong. She's a beauty, but you haven't seen her in quite some time. People change. How do you know you're still compatible? There are so many beautiful women right here who'd walk through fire to have you. I don't get it. It does not matter that we have not seen each other for some time. Our bond is strong and we write all of the time. I have been in love with Dao Ming since we were children. I could not imagine being with anyone else," he said firmly. "Wow, I had no idea," I said wistfully. "Of course, it would help if you'd open up occasionally and share a confidence or two." My eyes twinkled playfully as I nurtured my wound with the ice. "Forgive me. It is not my intention to keep you a stranger to me. You are like a brother. I hope you realize that," he began. "I was raised in a different culture and my family ways were instilled within me during my formative years. My parents and their parents before them all believed one should hold one's thoughts and words and share them sparingly. The ways of my ancestors are not so easy to turn away from. Can you understand this?" I nodded while I picked up the picture and studied it more closely. "It doesn't hurt that she's beautiful," I mused. "No, it does not hurt," he replied with a chuckle. For a brief second, he looked as if he was miles away in his mind. "We would have been together by now if she had not been called back to China." "What do you mean?" I asked with surprise. "Was she here and I never knew it?" "She was in school at UCLA," he explained. "She was studying to become a doctor, but her father became very ill last year and died. Her mother cannot afford to continue her education." I knit my brows together. "Wait a minute," I said with angst. "You mean to tell me that she was in this country, and I never got to meet her?" He heaved a sigh. "It is complicated," he said. "In the beginning she struggled with the language. Even though she was taught English in our country, she rarely used it in general conversation. She found it difficult to keep up in school. We felt the excitement of visiting would create an even greater burden on her abilities to concentrate on her studies. Instead, I visited her on several occasions." "So, that's the family you visited in California," I mused. "You should have met her over the summer," he said. "She was going to come here, but she was called back to China." "I'm sorry, man," I said. He filled his lungs with air before speaking. "Soon we will be married, and we will work together to find a way to complete her education. One day I will be the proud husband of a great doctor," he boasted. I chuckled at my friend's enthusiasm as I placed the picture back on the counter with a gentleness that equaled his just moments earlier when presenting it and slid it back to him. I slapped him heartily on his back and said, "I'd be honored." Chapter 3. Jessica eased her slender body from the driver's side of her silver BMW convertible. Her pale skin was in stark contrast to the thick ebony waves cascading over her shoulders. She struggled to balance the bulging bags of groceries in her arms as she carefully picked her way up the stairs and then down the hall of our apartment building. I'd repeatedly asked her why she insisted on loading her arms instead of making multiple trips. She couldn't really explain her reasoning. It wasn't as if she was a lazy woman. It was more the way she was raised. Her mother was a stickler about doing things in the quickest time possible. One trip was obviously faster than two. I heard her struggling with the key and briskly pulled the door open before disappearing and leaving her to enter and shut it with her foot. She didn't take offense. She knew this was the time of day I dedicated to training in my makeshift in-home gym. Bags toppled over as she set them on the kitchen counter. She rushed to retrieve several runaway apples before they rolled out of the kitchen and into the hall. A scowl creased her brows as she inspected one and saw the severe bruising it now sported. I turned on my soothing music and began my Tai Chi session. I found the slow and gentle movements of this ancient practice just the thing to help my body cool, stretch, and relax after a vigorous training. Jessica leaned on the wall while she watched in silence. The muscles on my back flexed and my skin glistened with sweat as I moved in slow, disciplined, and controlled postures. She often remarked how my strong, chiseled features reminded her of a Greek god, minus the beard. Her eyes traced down my torso. I allowed myself an inward smile. I knew she was admiring the round of my buttocks as it flexed beneath my lightweight sweatpants. It was her favorite part of my body. She'd learned a long time ago not to interrupt when I was training. I took my training very seriously, and the simple gesture of allowing me those few hours of peaceful focus made all the difference in my frame of mind for the rest of the day. I sometimes wondered how she put up with me. She often told me I was like a wild animal that needed constant care and restraining, yet she was content with our life together. She was certain my wandering eyes and fear of commitment would fade with age. In the meantime, she was willing to go the extra mile to keep my eyes and attention on her and her alone. She heaved a satisfied sigh before heading back to the kitchen and setting the apples on the counter before slowly and methodically unpacking the contents of the grocery bags and putting each item in its respective place. Looking around the kitchen, she spotted dirty dishes in the sink and set to task of putting them in the dishwasher and tidying up the countertops. When she was finished, she stepped back, placed her hands on her hips, and gave an approving nod. Just as I was set in my ways when it came to my training, Jess was set in her ways when it came to her home. She didn't function well when things weren't in their proper order. It was an affliction that was with her since childhood, something her mother was certainly pleased with. Needless to say, my drop-as-you-go habit took time adjusting to. Jess peered once again in my direction and smiled. When I reached the far side of the room, my eyes met hers as I slowly turned. I could see her shudder from the sensual chill running down her spine. Sensual chills weren't always her reaction. The first time she'd witnessed my vacant stare while performing Tai Chi, she was freaked out. She eventually discussed it with me. My explanation that I wasn't really looking at her but was in a form of walking meditation and my mind was only partially aware of what was going on in the room made sense, and her fears were replaced by lust. She shook her head to clear away the hypnotic sensation she sometimes had when she got caught up in watching my slow, methodical movements, and made her way into our bedroom. Her day had been more stressful than usual, and she longed to soak in a hot bubble bath. She quickly stripped off her clothing and headed for the bathroom. Pouring a generous amount of lavender-scented bubble bath into the running water, she distributed the ever-growing bubbles by slowly swishing her hand back and forth in the soothing, warm water. She then reached to turn on the radio that was precariously perched on the edge of a narrow shelf positioned at the end of the tub. She set the dial to an easy listening station before lowering her slender body into the oversized tub. The low tones of a flutist working his magic permeated the air as it coaxed her mind into deep relaxation. Her eyes were closed in blissful tranquility when I filled the doorway with my lean, 6-foot, 1-inch frame. My smoldering eyes permeated the pink flesh of her breasts as they bobbed above the bubbles. "Got room for me?" I asked seductively. Her hazel eyes peered from under her thick black eyelashes and smiled. "Come on in, dirty man," she cooed. I wasted no time stripping off my sweats and easing my body beneath the steamy bubbles opposite her. The heat soothed my overworked muscles while her giggles and mischievous tossing of tiny bubble clusters at me tickled and aroused my senses. It wasn't long before I lunged forward and covered her mouth with mine. Our passion rose as she returned my kiss with a sensuality that flared my loins with desire. Our lips never parted as I stood and pulled her up onto her feet. Scooping her slight, 5'3" body into my arms, I made my way into the bedroom and gently lowered her onto the bed. Our brief time in the bath wasn't enough to remove the scent from my strenuous workout. Rather than repel her, it roused a primal excitement. We devoured each other with passionate lovemaking until we lay, spent, upon the bed. Jessica laid her head on my chest as I pulled her close. All tension and anxiety from the day was gone. The beating of my strong heart had almost lulled her to sleep when the ringing of the telephone brought her back to reality. Reluctant to break the mood of the moment, we let the answering machine take the call. "Dan, this is Sheehan. It is important. Please call me as soon as you can." "Please," came Sheehan's voice through the machine. I tried to sit up and to reach for the receiver in hopes of catching him before I hung up. There was an unmistakable sense of urgency in his voice, something I'd never heard before. Jessica felt my muscles tense as I shifted position. She wasn't ready to release the feeling of euphoria and drew me back down to her with sensual persuasion. He said, "As soon as you can." "Right now, you can't," she murmured as she climbed on top of me. Although Jessica would never admit it to me, I knew she was jealous of my relationship with Sheehan. She occasionally expressed how she felt like she was competing with him for my time and attention. She claimed she struggled for whatever attention I gave her while I offered it to Sheehan freely. This wasn't true. It was just that Sheehan and I shared a world of martial arts that was first and foremost in my daily existence. The only interest she had in that world was watching my ass while I practiced. I tried to explain this to her, but a strong river of resentment flowed just beneath her surface of false acceptance where Sheehan was concerned nonetheless. Running her soft, moist tongue across my chest, she coaxed all resistance I might have had away. I shuddered with excitement and shoved Sheehan's phone message in the recesses of my mind as my loins came back to life. It was several hours after Sheehan's message before I slipped from the embrace of my sleeping and satiated girlfriend and made my way to the phone in the kitchen. Guilt swept over me as I dialed his number. His message sounded urgent. It was clear he had something very important to discuss. Disgust for my inability to control my carnal urges consumed me as I listened to the ringing through the receiver. Why did I allow lust to control me so? Why couldn't I be more like my buddy? I couldn't recall a time when he allowed his body's desires to take control. I promised myself that I'd work on conquering what I considered an undesirable flaw. Sheehan asked me to meet him as soon as possible at our favorite Chinese restaurant, with no further explanation. I readily agreed. Jessica popped her sleep-tousled head through the doorway. "What is it, baby?" she asked. I heaved a sigh. I'd always known Sheehan to be calm and collected. Hearing the strain in his voice put me on the alert. Something very serious must be happening. The craziest thing, I just don't know, I said. Chapter 4. I hopped out of a cab while Sheehan and a group of Chinese men stood huddled together watching me. Their faces looked solemn. I approached the group with a nod and shook hands with each man as Sheehan made the introductions to the few I didn't know. We entered Wang's Chinese palace and walked through the crowded dining room and into a larger room that contained a conference table with chairs around it. I lagged behind and watched the men take their seats with swift silence. Sheehan motioned for me to join them as the group spoke in their native language. Although I was studying Mandarin, I was still weak at it and they were speaking far too rapidly for me to follow the conversation. My buddy did his best to keep up with the flow of the conversation, while translating the important aspects of it for me. There have been rumors about forced slavery and prostitution for months, but no one has been able to prove it, he explained. There is a house in Poughkeepsie where they are supposedly sent to before they are shipped off. That's unbelievable, I exclaimed. I'd heard rumors as well, but I hadn't put much credence behind them. I sympathized with the families of these poor victims, but what did that have to do with me? Why was I called there? Although tempted to voice the question, I simply nodded and allowed him to continue. Yes, but very real, he said. It has been an age-old problem that never seems to go away. He paused, raising the suspense before continuing. We believe they have Dao Ming. You're kidding. Why her? I asked. I knew instantly how foolish my words sounded, but Shen seemed unbothered and continued. Dao Ming is beautiful, he said softly. Her mother entrusted her to the care of Madame Jia. In China, Madame Jia is well known for helping refugees into the States by smuggling them. She has many connections and has made a fortune from it. Smuggle? I mused aloud. Of course, he replied. As in other countries, there are many people in China who cannot find a good job to support their families, so they sneak into more desirable European countries or here to the United States. They indenture themselves to a business owner who is looking for cheap labor and who does not mind breaking the law. You will find them working in restaurants or other types of businesses to pay back the expense of getting them here. While they are working off their debt, they look for a way to stay and become a legal resident. These traffickers take advantage of this. They trap many of the immigrants before they can make it to their destination and sell them to the highest bidder. The traffickers believe no one will miss their captives because they are smuggling themselves in. It is a well-known risk many take. He was silent for a moment before continuing. Dao Ming was coming here legally. Her mother was only using the services of Madame Jia because Dao Ming and her mother always depended on her father to arrange these things. They felt Madame Jia was knowledgeable and skilled in what was needed. They hoped she would be able to make things happen smoother and faster for Dao Ming. Madame Jia is very expensive, but also very good. She is old and we didn't realize she was very ill, so her assistant took over for her. We do not know if the assistant is part of the scheme or just stupid. The authorities have her in custody, but we do not have our hopes very high. So many Chinese go missing each year and are never found. It is big business. It is very big business. I thought that stuff died when modern technology came into play, I said. Shen shook his head slowly. His face mirrored his painful worry. It only made it easier for them, he explained. You can actually shop for a servant or a sex slave online now. It is all underground, but if you have the code words, you can find the information. Unfortunately, it is hard to get these words. Only the richest people in the world are given them. Even then, I am told they change constantly to stay ahead of the authorities. I heaved a sigh as I asked, what do you plan on doing? I am catching a train for Poughkeepsie in 1 hour, he replied. Are you with me? Our eyes locked in silence while the men continue with their conference. Over the years our bond had tightened. We truly were like brothers. Of course, I was with him. He need not even ask. The conversation around the table grew more and more intense. One of the men shouted while pounding his fist on the table, but we didn't flinch as I slowly nodded my head in silent communication. There is one more thing you should know, before you say yes, he said in a voice that was low and thick. Shoot, I replied. I was a little startled by the cadence of Shen's voice and the sudden darkness of his eyes. The men we will be chasing are notoriously evil men, he said hesitantly. Well, I have to agree with you there. The slime buckets are probably, I began. Shen gripped my arm for emphasis as he continued, they are not just slime buckets, they are killers. Some say they are not human, but vampires. He paused while my face contorted in disbelief. He'd expected me to balk at such a tale like he had at first, but after the stories his uncle and his uncle's closest friends told him, he could no longer dismiss the rumors and added that possibility to the mix. Human or not, he continued, this is a very real business for them, and they will not like us coming to stop them. Men have gone before us and disappeared without a trace. It is possible we may not return home. It all seemed so surreal, almost like an episode of Law and Order or even the X-Files. I welcomed the oxygen I took in when I filled my lungs before nodding my head to indicate I understood. I may not have believed the dramatic story I was being fed, but there was no mistaking that my friend needed me, and that was enough. Whatever lay ahead, Sheehan and his uncle had become like family, and I wouldn't let them down.
This has been a sample of Vampire Iniquity to allow you an opportunity to truly see if this story is for you. It was created by AI. The actual audiobook in its entirety was narrated by a real human and is available on audible.com or itunes.com. It can also be obtained in eBook and print formats.